Our next speaker is someone that we also had here 6 years ago. Looking for him. There he is. And when we were at the airlane, and certainly gave us an incredible insight into the Canadian scene and internationally, regarding euthanasia. So he's the executive director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition since 1999, so a couple of years, and was the international chair since 2007. Alex co-produced the documentaries The Euthanasia Deception in 2016 and Fatal Flaws in 2018. Alex has authored thousands of articles, and his book Exposing Vulnerable People to Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide in 2014 was republished by Connor Publishing in Australia. And then in 2020, Alex co-authored a book of great articles titled Celebrating 20 Years of Protecting People, 1999 to 2019. Alex has spoken throughout North America, but he also participated in speaking tours in Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland. His speaking engagements have also taken him to Italy and Switzerland and Belgium and Hungary and Scotland. And Alex is married to Susan, and they have 6 kids and 2 grandkids. So here's a man of experience. Hear him up.
Look at the screen. The third grandchild will be with us on May 6th. So I actually have 3 grandchildren. One I can't hold in my arms yet, but we saw there was a baby here, so we all understand how great it is to hold a baby in arms. So is the PowerPoint going up? That's good. I'm going to jump ahead a bit because I don't want to keep you here all night, and I don't want to have any of that fruit tray thrown at me. So we're gonna move ahead a bit right off the bat. But I'll start with something that actually connects very well. The issue of euthanasia-assisted suicide, like many people view it within this paradigm of suicide. Now, not in the same sense as Leah explained, because they say, oh, well, in the case of assisted suicide or euthanasia, they say it's rational. Well, that's a whole nother point of view. Nonetheless, but they view it as a personal act. It's my body, my choice. I don't know if you've heard that before, but it's very similar to what Leo was saying. And they justify it based on this concept that they'll say, oh, well, these people are dying anyway, and we're really only, limiting their life by a few weeks. They say all we're doing is eliminating suffering for a couple weeks. And this term medical aid in dying is a Canadian term that we use just to make us feel better about all of this stuff. So let's move on. We oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide. So my talk could end right now. We oppose killing people. That's essentially what we're talking about here when we're talking about euthanasia. This is about murder. In fact, where do you find the euthanasia law in Canada? It's in the Homicide Act. It's Section 241 of the Criminal Code. And what we did to legalize euthanasia is we created an exception to homicide. So those people who are in the medical field and they're being told that this is a medical act, well, actually, it's not. It's an exception to homicide that we've now put upon the medical people to carry out, okay? Assisted suicide and euthanasia are a little different, but I'm going to get to that in a second with you. What the law actually does is it gives physicians and nurse practitioners the right and law to kill you. That's what the law actually does, okay? Let's move on. Why do people ask for euthanasia? So as I say here, there's 2 issues with this question. The question is, why are people approved for euthanasia? But the second question, which I think is far more important, is why are people asking for euthanasia? Why are people asking to have their life ended? And that's the data that you will not see in the Canadian reports and things like that, because that's not the data that they're actually seeking. What they're telling you in these reports is how old the person was, what medical condition they had, and that kind of thing. But the big question is why they're asking for it. And my experience, and I've dealt with quite a few cases now, and there's not been one case that did not fit this, other than a few radical autonomists. There are a few radical autonomists out there that say, my body, my choice, and they're the ones you see in the newspaper articles because they're the ones demanding their right to die. But other than those, most people are asking for euthanasia. Why? Because they're going through a difficult health condition, whether that be physical or psychological, and they are seeking a way out. They're going through depression, loneliness. They feel that their life has lost meaning, purpose, or value. I was talking to this person, and they were talking to me about why they wanted euthanasia, and they had difficult health conditions. They had called, and they were really interested in euthanasia, and we were talking about this, and then I was just trying to dig down. Why is this person actually seeking death? And the person said to me, I feel my life has no hope. I feel my life has no hope. So the question is, why do people feel no hope? What's happening in our culture that has people feeling that their life lacks hope? Therefore, legalizing euthanasia is not about freedom. Freedom is the flag they wave. Choice is the flag they wave to make them feel good about euthanasia. Euthanasia is really about abandonment. It's about abandonment. Why? Because we're abandoning people at the time, a difficult time of their life. Let's move on. Euthanasia was legalized in June of 2016 after the Carter Court case out of the Supreme Court of Canada. And then what we did is Canada, like typical Canadians, instead of actually following what the law said we had to do a review of the law starting in June of 2020. Instead, what we did is we expanded the law. So instead of reviewing the law, Trudeau decided, and David Lametti, our Justice Minister, they decided to expand the law. And so they passed Bill C-7. And you heard already from Leah that what that Bill C-7 did is it allowed euthanasia for mental illness. We got rid of the waiting period, and we allowed euthanasia for people who weren't dying. Now, the funny thing about that is the law originally said, as was mentioned, that the law said that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. That's what the original law said. And they interpreted that to mean that you had to have a terminal illness. And then there was the Truchon case in Quebec, which was challenging that. But the problem with it was it was all actually, how would you say, a stack of cards. That, you know how you play that game, you try and stack your cards up? Really, it was a lie from the beginning, because the term natural death must be reasonably foreseeable was never defined in the law. So it lacked meaning. There was no real meaning to it anyway. So by striking it down, what they were doing actually, they were, how would you say, pushing the point that you wouldn't have to be terminally ill. Now, what Leah didn't mention is the Truchon case was a lower court decision. And what was more important than anything else is the fact that the government did not appeal that decision. Now, think about this. This is a serious public issue, euthanasia, and they did not appeal a lower court decision. You know what I'm talking about? Lower court decisions are always appealed when they're of an important nature, because you want at least the Court of Appeal or possibly the Supreme Court of Canada to clarify. That never happened. Anyway, nonetheless, we move on. 10,064 deaths in 2021 by euthanasia. Now, I refer to this thing reported deaths for a very important reason, because I cannot assume that there weren't unreported deaths. I'm not going to get into that. I don't have a lot of time. But I want you to realize that in Canada, how the system works, and I mentioned it here, the data from the reports are submitted by the doctors who caused the death. So how the law works is it requires doctors and nurse practitioners, but it requires two of them. The first one would do an assessment. The assessment's really a tick box system. You know, do you qualify? And there's a bunch of tick boxes they were not, tick off. And yes, this person was competent. Yes, they had this condition. Yeah. And then they sign it off. It's not as people would think. You would think you're assessing somebody to kill them. And yet you talk to people, for instance, I was talking to someone who was approved for euthanasia, and they were telling me that the whole process just took about less than 10 minutes. They sat down with them. They had a very short discussion. The tick boxes were done. The doctor signed it. And then, of course, what happens is then another doctor or nurse practitioner is the secondary one. And all they're doing actually is, in most cases, all they're doing is approving what the first doctor has approved. Right? They're not actually, sometimes they will visit the patient, but not usually, okay? Not usually. So you actually have this system of really tick boxes that they are signing away, and they're approving you for death. Now, obviously, it varies on the doctor who's doing the assessment, because some of them would take it more serious than others, wouldn't they? Right? The real pro-euthanasia doctors, they're just trying to say, yes, this person qualifies and getting it done. But the data comes from the doctor who causes death. So how does the law work? A doctor can approve your death, can then kill you, and then it has to send in a report. Now, when you're coming to a meeting like this, and let's say you got a little bit late because you put on a jacket and you realize it was colder than you thought, so you changed your jacket, then you realize you lost 10 minutes, and you're coming here, and you're speeding down the highway at some crazy speed, did you call the police to come pick you up? No, you did not self-report that you broke the law, did you? So obviously the self-reporting system is designed for what? It's designed to protect the doctors who are involved with causing death. That's what the system's designed to do. Let's move on. So and this is the Ontario data. Now this is sort of important in some ways. I know it's data. My wife says it's boring, but I have to give you some data just like Leah gave you some court cases. So there we go. It's just what I have to do. Sorry about that. Anyway, there was 13,729 reported deaths by euthanasia and assisted suicide in Ontario between legalization and December 31st of 2022. Last year there was 3,934, which was an increase of 27% from the year before. What's important about it is that there was 13,726 euthanasia deaths in Ontario, and 3 were assisted suicide. Now, what does that mean? What's the difference? Euthanasia is when I kill you. That's euthanasia. I lethally inject you or I hook you up and we put lethal drugs that go into your system and you die, okay? It's me killing you. Assisted suicide is the same idea. I would give you similar drugs, but you have to take it yourself. So in Ontario, 3 people are doing it where 3 people did it where they took the drugs themselves, and 13,726 they were injected. And this is very important to point out because euthanasia is homicide, okay? The Quebec data came out for 2022, and the Quebec government, well, first they did their report, which showed that they had an increase of 5.1%. They had 5.1% of all deaths between April 1st and March 31st of 2022. But then they sent out a report in February showing that in 2022, the full year, 7% of all deaths were euthanasia. That's the highest in the world. And we're just seeing this increase. Now, I'm going to move on because there's more to talk about that, but I want to tell you some stories. And I think this is important. Why is this story about Candace Lewis important? Well, there's a few reasons why. Candace was born with multiple disabilities, and in August of 2016, she was in a hospital in Newfoundland, and the doctors were convinced that Candace was dying. So the doctors were told Candace's mother, Sheila, did she know that assisted death was legal? And of course, Sheila did not know that assisted death was legal. Now that should not bother you because not everybody watches CBC News, okay? So she did not know that assisted death was legal. Nonetheless, the doctor said he wanted to help her with it. He wanted to help her and help Candace die because he was a believer in assisted death, okay? And Sheila was saying that the family was not interested in an assisted death. They were not interested. So what he did then is he told Sheila she was selfish. She was selfish. And then he was pressuring Candace by explaining to her how sick she was. So when this happened, Sheila being Candace's mother, took the doctor out in the hallway and said, you're never doing that again. You're not talking to my daughter. Leave us alone. And so what Sheila did is she decided, well, if Candace is dying and they want to do assisted death in my daughter, but if she's dying, well, then she should die at home. So she brought Candace home, and she had family and friends help her out, and Candace didn't die. Candace was alive the year later for her sister's wedding. Candace was alive a year after that to do interviews with us for the Fatal Flaws film. Candace died, I believe now, a few years ago, but the point of it is she died a natural death. Now, I'm not suggesting that people who leave the hospital because they're told they're dying and they decide they want to die at home tend not to die. What I'm saying to you is you have a situation in August of 2016, only a few months after legalization, you've got a doctor pressuring a family for euthanasia. That shows you how quick things were moving. Let's move on. Roger Foley lives in London, Ontario. Roger Foley, this has happened in 2018. He was in the hospital. Now, first of all, he has cerebral ataxia, and his condition is degenerated to the point where he needs 24/7 care. Like, he is not capable of getting up anymore and doing things for himself. He does work his computer all the time. He's very active with his computer, but as you know, technology is developed that allows you to work on a computer without, having to do things in a big way with your hands, etc. But nonetheless, he was in the hospital because one of his caregivers had given him food that caused him to have food poisoning. So he decided he wanted self-directed care. Now, self-directed care is a program in Ontario, and he said, I'm not leaving the hospital till I get approved for self-directed care. So what self-directed care means is that the government will give him the money, and he would hire his caregivers, because he wanted to be in control of his caregivers to make sure that he wasn't poisoned again. He also talked about a previous time where one of his caregivers left his gas stove on, and he said, I can't get up and turn off the gas stove. I have to have some control over this situation. So what happened is the government actually declined him, turned him down for self-directed care, so he decided not to leave the hospital. He did in the end get self-directed care, but first what happened is a doctor came to him and explained to Roger that he could stay in the hospital and pay $1,500 a day. At the time, that's what they're saying. $1,500 a day is what they told him. Or you can have euthanasia. Those are the two choices they gave him. You can pay $1,500 a day or have euthanasia. Now, in the end, he did get approved for self-directed care and he did leave. I don't know if Leah's representing him, but he's still in a lawsuit with the Victoria Hospital because they want that money, the $1,500 a day. But of course, as you know, you can't get blood from a stone. He doesn't have $1,500. He doesn't have the money, that accumulated for his time in the hospital. Nonetheless, we go on. The Joan Rowaway case is very important. This shows you how crazy things get with euthanasia. So Joan was living in Vancouver area, and she had cancer, and the oncologist explained to her that there was nothing more they could do for her. She had come to the point where the treatment was of no further benefit for her. So in the conversation with the oncologist, the topic of MAID came up. Joan was not asking for MAID. Just the topic came up. Now, it's possible the oncologist brought up the topic. Nonetheless, the topic of MAID came up. The doctor went through all the tick boxes and signed the papers and approved Joan for MAID. So Joan was living with her daughter and son-in-law. As she was dying, she was living with her daughter and son-in-law, and they receive a phone call from Fraser Health. Now, remember that word, Fraser and then Health. Remember those words. They got a call from them saying, we're coming to get Joan for her MAID. Think about it. And the family said, what are you talking about? Joan has not asked for MAID. But they said, no, Joan asked for MAID and was approved for MAID. Now, she never asked for MAID. And they said, no, Joan's not interested in MAID. So then they sent two people to the door, to their house, to come get Joan because they were saying that the family was denying Joan her right to die. Okay? As crazy as that sounds, it's exactly what happened. And if you don't believe me, I can send you the article from the BC Catholic. The family was incensed by this. They refused to let them take Joan. And then finally, Fraser Health sent someone who was more of a mediator. And the mediator was smart enough to ask Joan, what do you want? And Joan says, I don't want MAID. So they left him alone. But think about this. In the discussion about MAID, when there was no further treatment that was available to Joan, they then took that as a request for MAID. They approved her for MAID, and then they took it as the family denying her MAID when it's something she never wanted in the first place. We move on. What about other stories? A 51-year-old woman. This was actually one of the key stories in the early issues when these stories started popping up. This woman in Ontario died in February of 2022 by euthanasia, by MAID. And what happened was that she's got multiple chemical sensitivities, and she was approved for MAID, and she needed a clean place to live. She said she could not live any longer in her social housing unit. So she was living in a social housing unit. She was living on disability. She wasn't able to work because of her constant reactions to chemicals and smells and things. And she had an extreme case of multiple chemical sensitivities. And so what happened is that there was some people who tried to raise some money for her, but it wasn't in time. She died by MAID. But she did make it clear that her intention was not to die by MAID, but in fact, she was saying, I couldn't live this way any longer. But then 2 weeks after that story of the death of this woman, there was a 31-year-old woman who was approved for MAID who also had MCS. So now you get this, how would you say, the copycat killing situation, the multiplicity of it was approved for one person and the next person gets approved. And so you have the story because what happened is the MCS community raised a fair amount of money for her, and she is alive today, living in a place because they were able to find her a place to live where she was not reacting. Because remember, with MCS, you need to live in a place where you're not inundated with smells and chemical fluids and things like that that you're reacting to. Well, I don't know about Thunder Bay, but there's a climate activist in BC who wants euthanasia for mental illness because he's got eco-anxiety. Are there people like that in Ottawa, Leah? I'm not sure. Eco-anxiety? Could be. Nonetheless, I don't know about Thunder Bay, but Victoria, BC, there's a guy who says he qualifies for MAID based on eco-anxiety. There was an Ontario man who was approved for euthanasia based on homelessness. We have all these cases. So this comes down to this fundamental question. There's the reason why they're approved. So, you hear Jocelyn Downey wrote this article saying, Jocelyn Downey is one of our key pro-euthanasia people wearing a white coat. So we have Yarrow over here, who's against euthanasia, and the pro-euthanasia people have Jocelyn Downey. Anyway, Jocelyn wrote this article saying, you know, people like, she didn't refer to me, but the anti-euthanasia people are lying to you because you can't have euthanasia based on poverty. And in fact, she's right. You can't have euthanasia based on poverty, but the reason those people were asking for euthanasia was based on poverty. The reason they were approved was because they have an irremediable medical condition. And essentially, even though when you look at the law, that's really what it comes down to. You have to have an irremediable medical condition. That's what it comes down to. I'm assuming there's lots of people in this room, or at least several, who have an irremediable medical condition. We move on. Oh, you already did. Thank you. There was the Veterans Affairs worker telling the guy with PTSD that he should have euthanasia. The story about that actually went further because when that case came out, the Minister of Veterans Affairs said it was just a one-off, right? Lawrence Macaulay, the Minister of Veterans Affairs, he said it was one bad case and that's all it was. And then they had a bit of an inquiry and they found out there was multiple cases like that. In fact, there's at least 2 people who died by euthanasia with PTSD who were also told to consider euthanasia, and they died by euthanasia. And, you know, this is what happened with this man in particular, the one who the case started becoming knowledgeable about. He ended up going to the U.S. So when he was so upset by being told that he should consider euthanasia, he went for treatment in the U.S., and that's where he went. Then we had the case of the Veterans Affairs worker telling a Canadian Paralympian who was also a veteran. This is a woman who was injured as a veteran. She was a veteran. She was injured in war. She became a Paralympian. She was asking for a wheelchair ramp. Which seems reasonable, wheelchair ramp. And she was told that if it's that bad, she should be asking for euthanasia. So we consider all this. There was the case of Madeline, and I think this really comes together for us. Madeline is a woman in BC who has a sort of a rare medical condition, and she says, I can't get medical treatment. I can get it in the U.S., but there's no money for me to get it in the U.S. I can't get medical treatment, but I can get euthanasia. So she was quite upset, and there's been several articles about Madeline. I actually knew about Madeline before the articles actually first started coming out about Madeline. Madeline's not her name, but her mother is a supporter of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. She had contacted me saying, you know, my daughter has this really rare medical condition, and she's really upset because she can't get medical treatment, but she's told she has no problem getting euthanasia. The 23-year-old young man in Ontario who had diabetes. Now, some of you might remember that case. His name was Keanu. His mother saved his life. So what can you do to save a life? Well, you can be like his mother, Margaret. So what happened is Keanu, during COVID, became very depressed, and he's insulin dependent. So he stopped taking his insulin. It didn't go well for him, okay? Did not go well for him. He did not die, but he lost 70% of his eyesight. So he can still see, but he's got serious eyesight issues. And now after COVID, he did stabilize, but then he was saying he wanted euthanasia. He was approved for euthanasia at the Maid House in Toronto. The Maid House is the euthanasia clinic in Toronto. They approved him. He had his date set for euthanasia, and then his mother found out about it, and she went ballistic. So what she did is she started writing to the media. She wrote to the Minister of Health. She really harassed, meaning challenged. I say harassed. She really challenged the doctor who was planning to kill her son, and she named him in all those letters. So you might have noticed the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I did work with her. I republished her letter, so I even named the doctor. Now, normally speaking, I wouldn't do that because I might have fear of some sort of lawsuit or something. But all I was doing is republishing Margaret's letter. So it wasn't like I was the one doing it. It was Margaret doing it. I was just republishing. So no one came after me. Nonetheless, that doctor in the end was so upset by the fact that he was being named and the rest of it, he decided not to kill Keanu. So then I spoke to Margaret. So Margaret calls me up and says, you know, Keanu's not going to die because the doctors decided not to do it. And I said, you better be careful because he's already been approved. So how the law works, it just takes another killer to agree to do it. But Margaret, I guess, was so vocal about killing Keanu that there's no other doctors come forward willing to kill Keanu. So he's still alive. Okay? He's still alive. Alan Nichols. This is an important case. I know this case extremely well because after Alan died, the Nichols family contacted me, and I helped them out an awful lot with the situation. Alan died by euthanasia in August of 2019. He was only depressed. So Alan was someone who went through ups and downs since he was a teenager. So when he was a teenager, he had a brain tumor, and he had the surgery for brain tumor that was successful. But it resulted, the family's convinced that it was the successful brain tumor surgery that resulted in him constantly be going into suicidal ideation. He'd go deeply depressed, and then he'd come out of it. And then he'd go back into deep depression, and he'd come out of it. So for Alan, he had gone through suicidal ideation many times before. The difference now in August of 2019 was euthanasia was legal. The doctor at the Chilliwack Hospital, now which hospital, Chilliwack Hospital is part of what? The Fraser Health region of BC. Just remember Fraser Health. It's pretty an extreme case. Like Fraser Health is pretty crazy. Nonetheless, they ended up saying, well, it's a request for euthanasia. They killed Alan. The family was so upset. They found out 3 days before he was going to die that he was going to die by euthanasia. They begged the doctors to reassess him, to change their mind. They said, you know, Alan's gone through this over and over again. Just look at his medical records. He's been in the psychiatric hospital quite a few times with suicidal ideation. This was not new for Alan. The difference was they said, well, we've approved him. He's approved, and they went ahead and killed him, okay? Now, I'll give you some more tragedy here. You know, on the law says they have to name not euthanasia as the cause of death. They have to name the medical condition that he had as the cause of death. So when his brother, who's in the right-hand side of the picture there, when his brother, who was his power of attorney, received his death certificate, it said on it, he had a seizure disorder. Now, this was very upsetting because Alan had seizure disorders when he was younger. But as his brother was saying to me on the phone when he got it, he says, this is shocking. Alan had not had a seizure in at least 30 years. But this is what they put on the death certificate to justify what they did. We move on. Euthanasia for mental illness. So Bill C-7 expanded euthanasia to mental illness. And then what happened is they originally said they were going to delay it for 2 years because they needed the rules in place or whatever to allow them to kill people with mental illness. So that would have meant March of 2023, they would have allowed euthanasia for mental illness. And now, you know, they've delayed it again for a year. So right now they're saying March of 2024, we will have euthanasia for mental illness. Anyway, I'm going to first go into another issue before I talk about Sonia Gain. Why did the government, why did David Lametti, our Justice Minister, delay euthanasia for mental illness? Now, he said, oh, well, we could have gone forward now. He made these comments, but we're going to be careful. No, he's not trying to be careful. Believe me. David Lametti, just so you know, he voted against the original euthanasia law in 2016 because it didn't go far enough. He thought in 2016 already we needed euthanasia for mental illness, okay? So Lametti is not saying we need to be more careful. He's very pro-death. Like, this guy's big time pro-death. No, what it was is he was getting a lot of heat from the cases. I've just gone through a few of the stories that he would have had to face. People with disabilities dying by euthanasia because of poverty, dying by euthanasia because they couldn't receive medical treatment, wanting euthanasia or being approved for euthanasia but wanting it because of homelessness. And there's multiplicity of issues here that were coming at them in a big steamroller. But you might also think, did any of you watch that W5 program on this? There must be somebody here who watched the W5 program. Hand goes up. There we go. There's a few of you saw that W5 program. How did David Lametti look in that W5 program? He didn't look good, did he? Because he was justifying euthanasia for mental illness, and they had interviewed all these people who wanted euthanasia, and some of them for mental illness reasons, and the whole thing did not look good for David Lametti. He did not answer those questions. He did not look like he was, how would you say, the compassionate man you would want to sound like when you're talking about euthanasia for compassionate reasons. Anyway, you might notice that it was just after that W5 program came out that he announced that they were going to delay euthanasia for mental illness for a year. So I think it was a combination of multiplicity of cases that were not going well for the government, that they had a lot of heat on them. But on top of it, there was a W5 program where he looked like crap, and he decided sorry, my French isn't good, and where he decided he was going to delay it for a year. Now, euthanasia for mental illness. Psychiatrist Dr. Sonia Gain, he's actually an important guy because he's a past president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. He teaches at the University of Toronto, and he was saying, he testified to the government that it's impossible to predict whether mental illness conditions are irremediable. Now, why is this important? Essentially speaking, what it boils down to in Canada, to have euthanasia, you need to have an irremediable medical condition. So obviously speaking, with Sonia Gain saying, I can't predict if you will get better or not get better. I can't predict that you have an irremediable medical condition when you have a mental illness. That would tell you that they should not be extending euthanasia to mental illness, that this should not be happening. But in fact, of course, the government didn't listen to Sonia Gain. We're going to move on. Dr. John Mayer, now he's also important. John Mayer, he's in Barrie. He's the editor of a psychiatric journal. And on top of it, John Mayer deals with hard cases. So if someone is receiving psychiatric treatment and they're not doing well, he's one of the people they could be referred to because he deals with hard cases. But Dr. John Mayer said a couple things which are very interesting. The first was, and I didn't put it on my slide here, he was saying, well, you cannot be approving euthanasia for someone who's got suicidal ideation when suicidal ideation is one of the symptoms of their medical condition, right? They have a psychiatric condition which makes them have suicidal ideation. How can you be approving euthanasia for that? But then he goes on and saying, allowing medical assistance to dying solely because of a mental illness doesn't take into account that these people may not be capable of making the best decisions for themselves. It's sort of straightforward, you would think, right? It's sort of basic, and yet this is what we're going on to. And then he also has talked about the fact that when they introduced the concept of euthanasia for mental illness, several of his patients decided not to receive treatment anymore because they wanted euthanasia. They didn't want treatment, they wanted death. Now, obviously, at this moment, they have to wait a bit longer. I'm actually not 100% saying that they actually have to wait. I'm not going to go on about that right now. I don't have time. We'll move on. Parliamentary Review Committee. Well, this is interesting. So then the government decided to have a review of the law, but they didn't really review the law. It didn't matter that the original legislation required a review of the law. They decided instead to review a further expansion of the law. So, it wasn't enough to have euthanasia for mental illness. It wasn't enough that we got rid of our waiting periods. It wasn't enough that we got rid of euthanasia for terminal illness. We now have to talk about other expansions. So what did we talk about? Euthanasia for mature minors, euthanasia by advance directive. These are the kind of things they're talking about. And then, the Quebec College of Physicians, they come up to talk to the committee. And under the issue of euthanasia for mature minors, they said, but we also support euthanasia for newborns. So let's think about this. They do that in the Netherlands, right? They have the Groningen Protocol in the Netherlands. They do have euthanasia of newborns. It is rare. Nonetheless, we're talking now about infanticide, okay? I know we have late-term abortion. So, as pro-lifers, it's all shocking. But we can see the natural progression. But remember, they sold euthanasia to us based on competent adults being capable of consenting, that this was about free choice and autonomy. Isn't that how they sold it to us? That this is about our freedom. Are newborns able to choose, request? Are they able to do these things? No. But, Dr. Muriel Goudreau from the Quebec College of Physicians, he tried to make people feel better by saying, well, it should only be based on suffering. And then he says, well, doctors can assess suffering. So don't worry, doctors can assess suffering. We should feel good about this. Everything's fine. And he said the parents should approve the death. Now, I consider this life unworthy of life concept. Why? This is the basic concept of eugenics, that there's certain lives not worth living, and that the society will eliminate lives that are not worth living. And I think that's what that's all about when we're talking about euthanasia for newborns. I'm going to throw something else at you. If you can have euthanasia for newborns, if we do go there, who else can't consent? Who else can't request? People with dementia, right? People with Alzheimer's, they will be seen as, well, they can't request or consent, so how will we then approve their deaths? Because that will become next. See, all this concept of consent and request has now been also turned upside down because they are what you would call, how would you say, safeguards that get in the way of one's choice, even though it's not about choice anymore. Choice is just the flag they wave to make us feel better about it. So anyway, the report of the Parliamentary Committee did then say we need to have euthanasia for mature minors and by advanced directive. Now think about this. That itself changes the nature of consent. Mature minors do not have the same capability of consenting as an adult, even if they think they do. And I know that Leah, when she was 12, was like 12 going on 37. Nonetheless, actually I shouldn't joke about Leah that way, sorry. Nonetheless, you know what I'm getting to. The point of it is that it's not the same thing. We've changed the concept of consent. And this should concern you, and it concerns me because that's what shows you where our country is moving. The good news is EdFast has a bill, Bill C-314, and that bill we should be supporting in a big way. I know that politics is not doing well in Canada right now, that democracy doesn't look too healthy. Nonetheless, this bill would make it impossible to have euthanasia for mental illness, and I would say that, and it will be debated. That's a private member's bill that will be debated before March of 2024. Therefore, we will have an opportunity to try and, how would you say, whether we can reverse the Trudeau negativity or not, what we can do is we can make it an issue again. We move on. Well, what about the Delta Hospice Society? I'm a member of the Delta Hospice Society. I'm actually a member of the board of the Delta Hospice Society. And I don't know why I did that, but I had nothing else to do, I guess. Anyway, it's actually good that I did that because it's an important issue. Who was the group that defunded the Delta Hospice Society and why? Well, it was Fraser Health. Fraser Health in BC, the Fraser Health region. And why did they defund the Delta Hospice Society? Because they refused to kill. They not only defunded the Delta Hospice Society, they expropriated their property. In Ontario, doctors aren't, it's actually not really happening, but the rules of the College of Physicians is that a doctor has to do what they call an effective referral. So if you're not willing to kill your patient, they're saying you must refer your patient to someone who will be involved with the killing. And this is the kind of thing that we're having right now with conscience rights. So we have these problems. So I'm going to move on. So this is the essential question. Euthanasia is sold to the culture based on personal autonomy. My free choice, my body, my choice. That's how they sold it. They sold it based on everybody wants choice, everyone wants autonomy. It was all a lie. We're told that assisted suicide is about people who are suffering and nearing death. If you actually look at the data, yeah, a lot of them are nearing death. That's true. But the suffering issue is not what you can call the priority issue. If you look at the data, people aren't actually asking for it. That's not the majority at all, even though that's what we're told it's about. We're told that assisted suicide is not a form of suicide because people are rationally choosing. I'm arguing that all these points are either philosophically wrong or they're wrong in the reality, okay, in the case. Move on. Why do people ask for euthanasia? This is the essential question. This is where we can make a difference in the world. People are asking for euthanasia. Why? Yes, they're being approved for euthanasia because they have an unremittent suffering, as they would say. They claim to be unremittent suffering, but they have an irremediable medical condition. That's why they're being approved. Why are they asking for it? They feel their life lacks meaning, purpose, or value. They feel there's no purpose to living any longer. They've become depressed. They are lonely. They feel there's no reason to live. I was talking on the phone to someone who called our helpline. He called up. It was interesting why he called up. There's somebody who was a supporter of ours who told him, why don't you call here and talk to them? So I ended up answering the phone. I was talking to this guy, and he had multiple health problems. And I felt very bad about the situation because, you know, he's telling me these situations that his health, and it sounded to me, and I'm not a doctor, so, you know, it sounded to me like this guy had some serious medical mismanagement problems because he was describing really quite bad situations, and I felt for him. But I wanted to dig down even with him because he's wanting euthanasia. And I said, well, why do you actually want to die, though? Why would you want to actually die? And he said, I'm alone, I'm lonely, I don't see any purpose. So even in his case, it came down to he was alone, lonely, he did not see any real purpose to living. That's what he was saying to me. Legalizing euthanasia is not about freedom, it's about abandonment, and I call them deaths of despair, okay? Deaths of despair. The culture of abandonment associated with euthanasia, we can change it by caring for others. So here's the problem here. We like to think in the massive macro sense of what we can do, and there's many things we can do in the macro sense, but in the micro sense of the life of the people around us, that's truly where we can make a difference in this world. It is essential that people who feel that their life lacks meaning, purpose, or value, who feel that their life has no continued reason to continue, that they have someone in their life who helps them find a reason to live. If you think about palliative care, good palliative care, when someone's approaching death, a good palliative care nurse would always say, our job was to help them find those little meanings as they were approaching death, because sometimes it was hard for them as they're approaching death to find a reason to live, okay? Because they are going to die. So, it was important for a good palliative care nurse, and they would always say that we would say, oh, your granddaughter's coming to visit. Isn't that wonderful? So we'd focus on that. Or tomorrow we're going to be doing this. Isn't that wonderful? So they would try and focus on that because they're trying to help that person who is dying find meaning in that every single day, because it would help them die a full death, right? A true death with dignity. But the same thing in our own life. We can change the world one person at a time. We can make a difference. Human experience tells me that it's normal. It's normal that if I'm going through a physical or psychological condition, it's normal that I might be also feeling physically, if I'm feeling a physical pain or I'm going through a physical difficulty, that I might also be affected psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. It's normal because I'm a type of a being. God created me as a complicated being. You're a complicated being because you are completely intertwined, right? You're physical, psychological, social, spiritual, and you're one, right? When I say this to people, they nod their heads. That's good. But I also think of my dog Rosie. She's not a complicated being, actually. We are complicated. I'm complicated. For my poor wife, I'm really complicated. But I mean, my dog, when I get home and I say to Rosie, let's go for a walk, her tail's going to be wagging like crazy. She's going to be so happy. Or if I say, Rosie, have a treat, she's all happy. Very simple. You can give me a treat and I might be happy a bit, but I know it's not the same thing. But it's normal that if I'm going through a difficult time, that I might also be affected psychologically. I might be also affected emotionally. I might be affected spiritually. When someone is seeking an end to that suffering, sometimes they have these deep blinders on. It's sort of like they can't see beyond that anymore because they're going through a difficult time. So I have to tell people, you have to understand, even people in your churches, even people who who have faith, are threatened by euthanasia. They are also threatened by euthanasia, not because they're terrible people, not because they lack faith, it's because they're a human being, right? They're complicated and they go through these emotions, and sometimes it's too much and it becomes too much for them to handle. On top of it, a lot of us go through that time with loneliness. A lot of us today are lonely. And if people say to me, oh, well, I know, I'm living in Thunder Bay, it's a pretty big city. You want to see loneliness, go on the Toronto subway. Look around. You see a lot of loneliness. I hate to say it. It's true. This is a lonely culture. You go to a nursing home. In a nursing home, there's lots of people around, yes, but the interconnections, the feeling of meaning, that relational is often missing for a lot of people. We are all affected by the legalization of euthanasia because we're human, right? We are human. We all experience these emotions. My life and your life are threatened by euthanasia. And why? When you're going through that difficult time in your life, in the past, someone might have said, well, we can help you through this. Now, it could be taken as a request for death, right? And, I often say to someone, well, if someone says to you, I don't know why I'm still alive, are they saying, please kill me? No, they're not saying, please kill me. They're going through their own existential or personal distress. They're wanting to be reaffirmed in some way. We must focus on visiting those who we know. We must recognize that our own faith communities, the own people around us, that we have to protect our own. I'm not saying we shouldn't protect others also, but I'm saying those who we know, we at least know of and we have a relationship with. It is our goal to replace the culture of death with a culture of care. This is what I'm focused on. We've started this compassionate community care. It's a separate organization. It's got a separate board. It's involved with what? Training people to do visiting. It's essential, training people to do visiting, training people to be involved with advocacy. Advocacy is fundamental, okay? But the reality is we can change the world one person at a time. By being with others, we make a difference in their lives. So accompaniment is essential. Accompaniment is essential. You are created by God. You are created by God. If my slide changes. You are created by God to be with others. Okay, that's how you're made to be. So by visiting and journeying with, what are we doing? Well, we're affirming a person's purpose for living. That's what we're doing. We're reducing their loneliness and isolation. Now remember, we're not trying to be psychiatrists or psychologists. We're not trying to be medical doctors. What are we trying to be? We're trying to be a caring, friendly person. That's what we're trying to be. We're trying to share ourselves with others. We help them find a way through their depression and isolation. You know, sometimes somebody, if you visit them and they're going through a difficult health condition, sometimes they don't want to talk at all, and sometimes they don't want you to talk at all. They just need someone to be with them. But, you know, you also allay their fear of suffering. Because, you know, the worst suffering is what? Suffering alone. Suffering alone is difficult. It's tough. You're a human being. You can be a person of great faith, and yet suffering alone can be a horrible thing that you go through. Interconnectedness is essential to the human person. Essential. And yet what's come on in our culture today? Today's culture is very individualistic. We've lost what it means to be human. The problem with euthanasia is it turns everything upside down. Why? Because what it means to be human is to be interactive. We're being with the person. We become caring. But if you stop caring for people, what does it do? First of all, it changes the other people who need you. But secondly, it changes you. You stop being that human being you need to be. How do I become human? Is it just God made me human and on I go? No, I become human by developing certain characteristics. The true human is a caring person who can make a difference. That's how God made you to be. But we become selfish in the culture. You know, it's easy to kill somebody. It becomes difficult to care. We're told that people ask for assisted suicide and euthanasia because of pain or suffering. The data actually suggests that's not true. That's the minority. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm not saying people don't suffer. I acknowledge that. I get these calls and I've been talking to people and they're suffering. I understand that. But why are they actually asking to die? It's because they are at a difficult time of their life. They feel lonely, depressed, socially isolated. They've lost meaning. They've lost hope. They do not see a reason to live. So here's the problem with euthanasia that we've had. I've got a petition on my table for talking about child euthanasia, opposed to child euthanasia. We're fighting infant euthanasia. We're fighting euthanasia for mental illness. Doesn't that seem insane? Nothing personal. Doesn't it seem like our country's a bit insane? And yet, what happened? There's only one line in the sand. The one line in the sand is, can I kill you or can I not kill you? That's the line in the sand. So you can't draw a new line in the sand. There isn't another line in the sand. So once it's okay to kill you, and that's what we have. We had abortion first. Now we have euthanasia. But once it's okay to kill you, what are we doing? We're simply debating who can do the killing and for what reasons. That's what we're doing in the culture. And every time there is a new line, it's not a real line because there's always something discriminatory. I'll give you a prime example. The law says, and it's about the only safeguard in the law, and when the law came out in 2016, if anybody was reading my stuff, I said it, even though I didn't like to say it, but it was true. The law said you had to be 18 to be killed by euthanasia, right? The law still says that. But isn't that discrimination? If it's okay to kill an 18-year-old, then why isn't it okay to kill a 17-year-old? There's no logic other than you have to be an adult, right? So now they're talking about mature minors. What about, they said you had to be competent. Well, now they're saying, well, you wouldn't have to be competent because you could put it in your advance directive. So you don't have to be competent. You can pre-request it. You can pre-request it while you're competent, so when you're incompetent, we can still kill you. Think about that. It's a bit crazy. There's only one line in the sand, and here we go. So I have some materials with me. I have a couple of these left. I've got this Made to Live book. It's by a hero of mine. His name is Dr. Paul Saba. I think he's a hero. He took his own money and he fought the Quebec government on the euthanasia issue. His little book here is actually quite good because it's very personal. He tells a very personal story. I'm not sure if it's as good as Leah's book, but that could be hard. But I mean, it's still an excellent book, okay? Anyway, I have a few of my Exposing Vulnerable People books. This is a few years old, but what I did with that book is I studied the Netherlands and Belgium data and the studies, and I went pretty deep into it. And I actually showed that all this euthanasia that was going on, the euthanasia without request, who were the ones dying by euthanasia without request? There were people in the hospitals who tended to be elderly, who tended to be incompetent. So the doctors were killing them. And we only knew about it because the Dutch, unlike the Canadians, we haven't done any studies on actually how many euthanasia deaths are happening outside of the law. We haven't done those studies. The Dutch were doing those studies, so they were uncovering it, okay? I've got the petition you can sign. I've got some newsletters back there, and I've got a power of attorney document. So I charge $10 for the power of attorney document. It might save your life. It's very simple. It makes it very straightforward that you don't want euthanasia, you don't want assisted suicide. It's a legal document. And I've got the Do Not Kill Me card with me. Do Not Kill Me card is easier than a tattoo. Very good. There was actually an 81-year-old woman in Calgary who first had the tattoo done. And that was soon after it was legalized, euthanasia was legalized. She was a supporter of ours. She sent a picture of her arm after the tattoo, and it said on it, "Do not kill me. You know, I'm opposed to euthanasia." And I thought, well, then I could produce a card. You sign it. It allows you to sign it and sign it with a witness, so it's almost like a legal document. I don't know if Leah would consider it a legal document, but it's pretty close. The tattoo is more effective because they can't miss it. But I mean, the card at least does something. Anyway, are there any questions? Yes, sir. $9:41. Because I think I've only got a few minutes here. And actually, you guys have been very patient because it's getting late. And I'm getting tired too, nothing personal.
So is there a way that those who are doctors, nurses, pharmacists can protect themselves participating in MAID without losing their license?
The answer has been so far yes, but it's a touch and go situation. Losing your license, actually, I don't think is what would happen, because there was the court case that Alberto's and the Physicians for Life and the Christian Medical Dental Society and the Catholic Physicians Guild were involved in. And out of that, even though we didn't win, there seemed to be a situation where they were sort of suggesting that no, it wouldn't be a medical license. Nonetheless, I know what you're getting to. As of things right now, in most major hospitals, they have a MAID team. So let me tell you, these MAID teams are pretty aggressive. But what it means is those who do not support euthanasia are not being faced with the issue of having to do it or be involved in it because the MAID team takes care of it. So these are professional killers, you know, because that's what they are. Let's be brutally honest. And there's so many of them. And over lunch, we were talking about it a little bit, how many were on the MAID team here in Thunder Bay. And there's several doctors. I guess there might be I'm not sure if you even have a nurse practitioner on it, but there's several here in Thunder Bay who are part of the MAID team. Now, the problem is if you're in a small community, that becomes a problem. And I've had several phone calls about nurses, etc., in small communities. Because if someone's asking for MAID and they're in a small community, and you're the only nurse on staff, and they're planning to do a MAID, and some, you know, they might try and force you to participate, and you may say no, and all the rest of it. So it could be touch and go. Nonetheless, if you're in a major hospital, the MAID team takes care of it.
Right. Now, there's a situation that Love commented on. A woman with ALS is afraid to choke to death, and so she wants MAID.
Well, these are hard cases. So let me first tell you a story, then I'm going to get to your answer. I was on a bus at the end of COVID. I was doing a talk. I forget where I was doing the talk, but I couldn't get it like this. Okay, I'll tell you. This time, I did not fly out of London, Ontario. Usually I go London to Toronto, and then I would have gone to Thunder Bay, right? But for some stupid reason, a flight out of London, Ontario to Toronto, connected to the flight to Thunder Bay, was ridiculously expensive. It was ridiculous, and I couldn't put that on your cost, okay? I just couldn't do that to you. So I drove to Toronto with my daughter and gave her my car for a couple of days, and she's going to pick me up at the airport. And it was the same thing that time, but because post-COVID it was a little different because there were so few flights going from Toronto to London that I was always taking the bus. So I'm sitting on the bus going from Toronto to London, from the airport to London, and I'm sitting beside a guy, and this is going to come to a good answer, just so you know, you're wondering where I'm going with this, okay? And I'm sitting beside a guy, and he's a young guy, and he's telling me he's on the Western Mustangs football team. The Western Mustangs have a good football team. And we're sort of talking, you know, I'm an old guy, so he's sort of talking to me like I'm sort of like a dad type, and that's fine. We were connecting. Conversation was going well. He was telling me about his girlfriend and his school, and then he mentioned he was actually the quarterback for the Western Mustangs, and I thought, well, that's pretty impressive, actually. That's pretty impressive. And then he asked me what I do for a living. And I told him. I run the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and he's a bit quiet because I don't think he realized euthanasia humans. He was probably thinking dogs or something, I don't know. And then he asked me a bit more about it, and I said, well, I'm opposed to killing people. And he's a bit quiet. He's a bit quiet. You know? And then he starts asking me a couple difficult questions. Now, this is a difficult question. ALS, someone's having a problem swallowing. He didn't ask me that question, but he gave me some tough questions. And I said to him, you know, there's lots we can do for people who are suffering. We don't need to have people suffer. We can provide excellent care for people if we, as a culture, decide to do that. We don't have to have people suffer like that. But I don't feel safe in a culture that kills people. I said, I'm opposed to killing people. And he was quiet. And he sat there. And then he said to me, I don't know, it's about 45 seconds later, I agree with you. So, you know, I'm not saying it was the easiest answer to the question, but, you know, here's the problem with the hard case. No matter what answer I give, it's the same thing as a situation talking about rape and incest. I believe rape and incest, we should not be having abortion, of course, for rape or incest or anything. Why? I'm opposed to killing people. I think we should be caring for the woman and providing proper care for her. And I don't think abortion provides the answer. Nonetheless, if you say that to someone who's been raped and they're going through this tragedy, you can say all you want. Hopefully, they choose the right thing. So here's a situation with ALS. Yes, they don't have to choke to death. These are very difficult situations. Palliative care has been properly dealing with cases. There are palliative care experts who deal effectively with ALS. Is it an easy death with ALS? No, ALS is a terrible condition. Let's be brutally honest. None of us will say that is a condition that, you know, nonetheless, they do not need to be choking to death. We do not need to kill them, okay? But that's the short of it. But of course, that is a hard case, yes. There's no question about it.
One last thing to comment on. Someone was noting that in their church, a few years ago, they learned that their church allows temporary anesthesia for severe pain. Not sure exactly what that is, but...
Okay, you're talking about putting someone into a type of a sleep, right? So what happens is if someone has a lot of severe pain, let's say they've had cancer and they've had a lot of treatment for cancer, and it's come to the point where, you know, the treatment isn't going to help. This person's actually now dying. Often what happens over a period of time with long-term treatment, and they've had a lot of treatment and heavy treatment, is they'll get a little bit of breakdown in the system. So you might have this type of pain, which is neuropathic, right? The bone against bone type pain. And it's very hard to deal with that type of a pain. So I'm recognizing that this is a rare condition again. This is not happening all the time, but it can happen where someone is in a lot of pain, and you can use a large amount of analgesic painkiller, and yet they're still not going to be comfortable. It might feel a lot better than they would have, but they're not comfortable. So the answer to that situation is, yes, you can put them into a sleep. Right? So we're not killing them, we're putting them into a sleep. Now the argument during the legalization time, when we were legalizing euthanasia and we were debating it, the other side would always say there's no difference between putting someone into a sleep and killing them. Well, obviously there's a big difference between putting someone into a sleep and killing them, because if you do so intentionally, put them into a sleep, like a deep sedation, right? You're not actually killing them. But killing them is actually killing them. There's a clear difference where we can allow a natural death to occur without killing somebody. And I say before, if you go back to the slide, you say, I'll tell you again, the reason why it's never acceptable to kill is once you've crossed that line of killing, as pro-lifers, we know, once you cross the line of killing, what are we now saying? If I'm saying it's okay to kill, even only, let's say we came up with a law that says it's only acceptable in this case, and that case, and that case, and that's it. Well, now we say it's okay to kill. Well, guess what? all those restrictions will then be seen as what? Discrimination, because we're denying somebody else the right to die. And someone would say, well, wait a second. You said it's okay for ALS, but it's not okay for MS. Why is that? And of course, so they would argue, well, I have MS, so I should be able to have euthanasia. You've already said it's okay for the, the point of it is you cannot cross the line. That's the essential thing. We have to care for people, not kill them. I'm opposed to killing people. I do also argue a couple things. I'm gonna give you a final thing. I'm really pleased to be here for your 50th year. I was born in 1968. My mom started in pro-life in 1971. My mom founded Woodstock Right to Life in 75. So they would be at 48 years. She just recently retired from her pro-life work because she got married for her 4th time. My mom's outlived 3 husbands, okay? So now she's married. She just got married in February for her 4th time. She's got her 4th husband. And so she decided now with the 4th husband, she's 82, that she's going to let someone else do the pro-life work for a while because, she's got a new husband to worry about for a while. Anyway, but I grew up in pro-life, so I'm really pleased that you're having this 50th anniversary. I think pro-life work is essential to the culture, that even if you don't know that you're saving lives, you're making a huge cultural difference, even if sometimes you don't feel you are. I'll say another thing, which is essential. We must stand up and make our arguments clear, but we don't have to get into all the difficult issues. Like some people, the fact of it is it's wrong to kill. That's the basis right off the bat. It's wrong to kill. So, I was having a meeting with this Tyler, for instance. Tyler is a young man. He's not that young, but compared to me, he's young, I guess. And he wants euthanasia, and he's got mental illness issues. He's been homeless. And I had lunch with him. So I contacted Tyler. He agreed to have lunch with me, and I'm sitting there having lunch with him. And Tyler wants euthanasia. Tyler's been homeless for much of the last 8 years. He's got several mental health problems. Nonetheless, he wants euthanasia, he's saying. So I said, Tyler, is it okay to kill Alex? Is it okay to kill me? He says, absolutely not. It would be absolutely wrong to kill you, Alex. Okay. I said, so Tyler, is it okay for me to kill you? And Tyler said, if I ask for it. I said, Tyler, what's the difference? Come on, let's be honest here. What is the difference between me killing you or you killing me? Honestly, let's be brutally honest. The act is the same. The act is the same. I'm opposed to killing people. I think we should try and keep it as simple as possible, because the fact of it is the radical autonomists, the radicals, they think that killing is always fine, basically. That's what it's come down to. I'll say another thing. We got to go back to our roots. What is our base? I'm not saying we should just stick with our base, don't get me wrong, but pro-life groups, a lot of them are having difficulties. We need to go back to our base and invite those people in our churches back into our groups. We have to go back and make those personal invitations to come back, get involved in pro-life, seek people out. And people might say no to you the first time, they may say no to you the second time, and the third time they'll say, yes, that's important, I'll join you and I'll help you out. Because the fact of it is we need to be inviting people to be back in this work, and it takes one-on-one to ask them. So we need to go back to our base. That doesn't mean we should stick to our base. I'm just saying the base is needed to be activated, and that takes work. My mom did that for years and years and years and years and years. There's ladies here, not only ladies, men here who've done that in Thunder Bay. We need to go back to that one-on-one, talking to people and asking them to get involved. And that's all I have to say, I think. Thank you.